Hello and welcome. Pulp fiction. For many people, I think that is still the name of a Tarantino film that was very, very successful in the 90s. I always thought that it would stay the embodiment of hip, but I've learned that a lot of younger people don't remember it very much, and if they do, they don't consider it very, very hip anymore. Maybe that's the way things go, and maybe a lot of things there are not applicable to the zeitgeist of the new millennium. Pulp Fiction, though, is more than that. I think the Tarantino film showed that it had to do with crime stories of a certain type. But of course, pulp stands for the substance that certain cheap paper was made of. And pulp is actually the name of an era, I would say. The kind, it's not a genre. It's many genres put together, put into a certain age of mass publications of stories. I wanted to say cheap stories, but the stories are not cheap usually. The print is cheap. The books, the way it was published was cheap. But the books themselves often had qualities that were discovered later and were were celebrated much later than they were. Today I have 3 books about pulp literature. And the first one is called Pulp Culture, which shows that it even in the days the book was published, it was seen as a whole culture rather than just a kind of literature. The good thing is that pulp is full. Oh, there's even a business reply card in there. Let's leave it in there. I'm always happy to find stuff like that. The nice thing about the pulp era was that it was very, very graphic, not in a not in the sense of horrible and violent, although that plays a role too. But in the way of immense measurements of, I can't put it into words. It's incredible what kind of art was created in those days. And if you ask me what I would rather have, like a painting from the museum from one of my favorite painters, let's say Mondrian, for example, or an original of one of these pulp paintings, I would go for this. Because to me it's incredible, even on the first pages, right? The spectacular imagery in the wonderful craftsmanship and also stylish experiments to be found on these covers. As you can see, this book starts right at the beginning of mass publications, like in the early 20th century, and you can imagine. I mean, going to newsstand and finding images like that. As far as I understand, a lot of these magazines were a mix of news articles about spectacular things, what you would call tabloids today. And stories, and maybe even was it even the first time that true crime literature and so on were published? Probably, I would suggest. Of course, the whole idea of these spectacular, exploitative literature publications goes back even longer to the 19th century, when penny dreadfuls were published. And cheap newspapers in the London of Sherlock Holmes and Jack the Ripper, but they were not. They didn't have these covers, of course, because the printing had become cheaper and more able to create art like that. To me, these pictures are incredible, and I have looked through a lot of books like these, art books, and looked for different artists of that era. And every time, I must say, I discover pictures I hadn't seen before. And in contrast to a lot of other things, I don't get used to it. It's not that I say, oh yeah, okay, I've seen a lot of that. Like this, right? It's not only women. As we will see later, women and scantily clad women have become kind of a staple of pulp literature. But here you have situations and a kind of drawing that reminds me of Norman Rockwell even sometimes. And you have photographic, lifelike pictures of things and I can't say enough good things about the whole era that is represented here. And if I look at books today, there are some interesting YouTube videos about that, about the development, for example, of book covers, especially of horror book covers. It's really a shame. I mean, of course, today we have like a lot of retro movements and appreciation. There are some newer publishers that go back to this whole feeling of the old style, but a lot of the modern designs are what would you call them? Photoshopped things that have some aesthetic as a basis, but it seems like instead of presenting scenes from the stories and making you interested in it, giving you some idea of what it's about. Instead of that, they want to create some mysterious mood or have some aesthetic background. Also reminds me of when Stephen King's It came out in the old country, and suddenly all of his following titles were changed into pronouns or single words. So instead of misery, you had the equivalent of she, right? And instead of the Dark Tower, you had black, and things like that. I think that stands for a lot of the developments in publication. For some reason, you don't want your book to look like this, and I wonder why. I can understand that after that era, you know, when it slowly faded in the 1950s and 60s, even in the 70s we had things like that, but then it started to turn into trash, right? People said, oh, that is all trash, we need a new design, and then you had, I think, books that looked more understated, and that was good too. I mean, there are great covers from the that one's brilliant here. You had covers in the 80s that were also great and brilliant. This era here, it was... can you publish something like this today? I mean, today we have feminist discussions about video games and the way women are presented there. Of course, this is the embodiment of exploitation, not only of women, but of everything, I would say. And I hope we'll get over this idea that art like this is somehow teaching people social norms or whatever. And if it does, can you only teach by example, by a positive example, or could you teach by saying, the way people are represented here is glorifying war and something like that. I don't know. What I know is that this era was incredible, and as you can see, it's even the way that machines and planes and so on were represented. That was a golden era for graphic design. And I think we are right in the middle of a new era of graphic design, because in those days you needed artists to paint for all kinds of publications. And even the insides of these books had, as we will see later, had wonderful and interesting drawings, black and white, of course, but nevertheless quite wonderful. And we have that again today, not for print publications, but for the internet and homepages and so on. And if you look at, DeviantArt and even on Kickstarter, you constantly have books being offered by great artists. So I think we had a long time of lack between the era of pulp fiction and the internet. And now we've gone back to that, and that's a good thing. I just hope that the ideas of political correctness and so on will not isn't that? It is graphic, right? Pretty much so. That we will have a time when everything is possible again. Because as you can see, whatever you saw here, this is not the what you call men's magazines of the 60s and maybe 50s. I could make a video about that too, because I like those pictures too. Because there you have the sadistic type of horrible mutilations and tortures and so on. And this is quite understated. Because maybe that's the difference between pulp fiction and pulp magazines, or men's magazines era. So as you can see, this is a great book about the books of that era, and as you could see, also a lot of good pictures, not much text. If you want to see more about the whole culture, actually, because that was the title of this book, and this book should rather be called like the art of pulp fiction or something, because this is called the art of pulp horror, and it concentrates on the horror aspect, but it could also be called the art of pulp culture, horror culture, or whatever, because as we will see, this book, and on the first page you can see it right away, is not only about the magazines, the literary magazines and the books and novels. It's also about comics. It's about films. As you can see here, Penny Dreadfuls, pre-code horrors, that usually refers to the comics, the Shutter Pulps, Poverty Row, that's cinema, drive-in delinquents. This is printed on wonderful glossy paper with a lot of black backgrounds, and that leads to a lot of fingerprints being seen there, but it's just a beauty. And as you can see here, this leads us into later times and different eras than the other book. So if you own both books, you're a happy man, I would say. Because and here you have modern interpretations of pulp culture and so on. Here we go back to the 19th century with what I said, the Penny Dreadfuls and so on, connected with modern interpretations, artistic representations of the time. This book really does a good job of connecting things like the art movements in Europe in those days, and the connections that could be seen, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein and so on, connections to the later development. And here you can see the inside illustrations of these books and magazines too, and they are incredible. I should have looked for a list of synonyms for adjectives, because this is really the stuff where my jaw drops, and I cannot say enough good things about this stuff. By the way, the modern interpretations here, as much as I like them, I always feel they lack the kind of innocence. The people who drew the modern things knew exactly what they were doing, did a fine and a wonderful job, but they never touch me as much as the originals, I would say. Why is that? I mean, look at these. These were real film posters from that era. Isn't that incredible? I mean, you see a lot of film posters like reprinted, like with Star Wars. The Hildebrand cover or poster for Star Wars was pulp, and it was incredible and wonderful. But these old things where you don't even know the films, the style they were drawn in, absolutely marvelous. I have the feeling that I lost my train of thought, and I will do it all the time. Like my train of thought crashes into something whenever I turn the page. This is, what, do you call that a page turner? I think it is. It's a wonderful coffee table book, and as you can see, it's also divided into eras, because up to now we are in the 30s and 40s and the cinema and so on. And this hasn't been the chapter about cinema and so on. So here's the Shudder Pulps with I think the style we saw in the last book, but concentrating on horror alone. And you have texts about the artists like Margaret Brundage. And so you can, very fast, you can learn some background about the time, the style, the era, and the artists. And then you have pages over pages with just small texts and incredible art. I really, really love that. Let's leave a little further, and Poverty Row. So this is about films in general, and here you can see they show the art of the posters, but it's also about the kind of films that existed. It's like different subgenres of horror in those days. Bela Lugosi and Karloff and so on, and the style of posters. I've got a lot of film poster books, but although there's in a smaller size here, there's a lot of posters printed in here that I've never seen before. Seduction of the Innocent, that's about the development of comics, including my favorite ever comic book series or publisher, EC Comics. I will definitely make a video about EC Comics and probably EC comic books at a later time. That's a chapter in itself. So I argue that this book, of course, even if you're not particularly interested in pulp literature of the 30s, 40s, this book is incredible, because you see the connection of the pulp style to, for example, if you're just a movie fan, you can get into Indian movies and the styles and modern representations. I don't remember the name of this artist, but I have a book by him. It's also incredible, and it underlines, by the way, what I said before. Today, a lot of film publishers or publishers of Blu-rays and DVDs, like Arrow, I would say, go for new art, but inspired by the style of the classical drive-in pulps and so on, and that's a good thing. Although I could imagine taking a lot of these old classic films and giving them a totally new look in a new style, as long as it's not this boring kind of photoshopped mood art that I mentioned before. Paperback pioneers, you learn about weird tales, weird nightmares, exploitation, explosion. Here we are in the 70s, where the art usually, as you can see, changed, and it goes to the video era, where art was still important, but you had to create something that would look good on a videotape instead of on a poster like this, for example. I mean, what that's modern. Okay, that's not 70s, I would argue, I think. And you had a lot of rather more photographs on here, but you can follow, if you've watched the book from the beginning, you can follow the style and see that, Italy, posters from a lot of countries, even up to the 80s, and I wonder if it goes on, up to the 80s followed this style of pulp, and here we are slowly coming to the 80s, I mentioned before. Great covers, a lot of them, but more understated. Not as much in your face. And I think that was a problem with the books in those days. The great examples, I mean, if you see one skull floating in darkness, that's cool. But if you see 10s, 20s, 30s of them, it becomes boring. And the old pulp, this overwhelming pulp stuff, never became boring, right? Here's even a chapter about the old country, about the, I suppose, most successful horror hero in book history. I don't know how many hundreds of books were written about him. Not so much known by people outside of Europe, but anyway. Yeah, there's an index too, and what else can I say? This book I would say is a total must buy, even if you are just peripherally interested in horror. In horror, okay? I wanted to add pulp, but it's not even about pulp. This is a perfect horror book about films, literature, art in general. Did you realize something? Yes, you did. You realized that we had wonderful pictures, but we have no idea what these things read like. You know, what was the style of writing? And I think there are some publishers today, especially with ebooks and so on, who republish old books and collections of stories from the books and magazines we just seen. One of the oldest ones I discovered at my university library at a certain point. Of course, it did not have this wonderful thing. It looked like this, and I saw it from the side, and the word hit me, and I looked through it. And in those days, there was no eBay, no Amazon, and so I couldn't get it. Now I own a copy, and so I've realized it's really, really dirty, actually. But that's okay. You know, it's pulp. Even that paper looks like pulp to me, and that's fine. Because what's inside here is not the glossy kind of photo show and picture show that we had before, but a whole great number of little stories, you know, from the pages. And what you often get, if I look at the supernatural part, I see the name H.P. Lovecraft twice here, and I see Clark Ashton Smith and so on. This little horror part you find very often, I think, reprinted as books by these authors. But I rarely see texts from the sports pulps, or from the aviation and war pulps, and the Western and so on. And I must say, I'm not interested enough in sports or Westerns to buy a whole book about them. But to have all that in this one book, as you can see, printed, the book was printed in, I suppose, 1970, in a way that is not as pleasing to the eye as the other books. You have pictures too, even colorful pictures, not printed as nicely. But I suppose in 1970, if you got this book and you could look through that, you would have said, oh, that's incredible. Although maybe you would have said, that was the trash I remember from my grandfather. Because, there's this thought experiment, you know, that always surprises me. If I look at this book, you know, it's from 1970. So that is like 50 years ago. This book has been published longer ago than this book was distanced from the era of the pulps it was describing. Was that correct English? I hope it was clear what I wanted to say, but the people reading this book here when it came out, there's even more colorful pictures than I thought. We're closer to that time, and probably they thought, okay, this is the old stuff my grandparents read, or at least my grandfather. Because I don't know if it's correct, but I have the feeling that not many of these pulps were read by women. There were romantic pulps as well, of course, but were they called pulps? in the development of literature and so on. I think there's enough examples even today of cheap women's literature that would be called pulp, but supposedly they didn't have these great violent exploitation covers and so on. As you can see, some of these stories are quite short, or the text or whatever it is, and it has these wonderful reprints of ads for certain things. And I made a video about some of these ads and what you got if you ordered them. Check it out if you like. And you also have some of the letters being sent to these magazines, which is quite nice. Oh yeah, that's an ad too. I remember these like comic book ads even in cheap novels and pulp stuff I read in the 80s and so on. The letters you find here are very, very interesting, of course. Because if you happen to be a fan of H.P. Lovecraft, as I am, you will know that at the time he was writing his stories and he was reading stuff and so on, that was the time when pulps were really going, and Weird Tales was a thing. And Weird Tales wasn't just like a publication of books and stories. It was like a interactive thing. Actually, you could write letters there, and you could expect them to be published at a certain point. And others would send letters too, and so there was a little discussion going on, like in a forum or something. People even made a name for themselves, not by writing stories, but by talking about stories. And people started writing letters to each other. So that was also the time when people started creating clubs, or at least interest groups, where they started discussing things. And Lovecraft himself was, they say, one of the most prolific letter writers probably in history. At least many letters of his still exist and are published. Which can create problems if you think that his views on certain social issues are problematic today. But if instead you are interested in nerd culture, or rather the culture of fandom, of people being interested and using things like science fiction and horror and crime stories to discuss things about real life and how they saw it, then you must say, yeah, that's the point. That's before the internet, This is the where it started, where fandom started and became a thing. And a lot of the letters, for example, that Lovecraft wrote, he didn't publish them, right? So if he said a racist thing, then that wasn't meant to be his Mein Kampf, to start a movement or whatever. It was just his damn opinion. And we should appreciate that this exists, that was the first time in this book I saw poems by H.P. Lovecraft. Today there's a lot of them, but when I saw that, I think in the 1990s, that was the first time I saw poems, and I was totally taken aback, and I copied those and kept them at home. Yes, as you can see, a lot of writing, not much graphic content I wanted to say, but I think there's enough if I look through it. Yes, and if you can get hold of this book, I think this is a nice start for somebody who's also interested in reading this stuff. As I said, you can get the complete Lovecraft now for very cheaply in ebook form, and there's even very good audiobook versions of all his writings. And supposedly you can get cheap copied PDFs or ebook variations of old magazines or whatever. That would be great, actually. But if you just say, okay, I'm kind of interested, I want to see what this is all about, getting this book would be great. If there's another book, a more modern book that does the same thing, you know, like taking sports, Western, horror, and so on. If there's something out there, please tell me. I'd be very, very interested. So all in all, I must say that it's quite difficult to put all these now together on the table, because as you can see, these books are not they have a different size than most books, okay? Than most of these books. They are wide. This one's wider. This one's the culprit, right? This is much wider than this one, and this one is even wider than this one. Incredible, but great, I think, because why limit your books just for convenience? I think all of these books are great and wonderful, and if you are interested in just one, then get this. If you're interested in the art, buy this also, and if you're interested in the content and writing of the pulps, by all means try to find this. I think it's not very expensive, I suppose. Maybe it is. Maybe it's very, very expensive, and I could make money selling it, which I won't. That's why I do this. Yeah, these are books I like. I will probably make videos about books I don't like. That might be interesting too. But for the moment, these books are highly recommended.